Welcome back to the greatest philosophers of all time. I'm your host, Emma Carter. Today, we shine our spotlight on a lesser known yet profoundly influential Greek thinker, Permedius. And as always, I'm honored to be joined by our resident expert, Dr. Rhys Morgana, classicist, philosopher, and professor, with over 20 years of teaching at universities around the globe. Dr. Rhys, it's truly a pleasure to have you with us again. Your insights into these great minds never fail to inspire, and on behalf of everyone listening, thank you for carving out time from your busy schedule.
Thank you, Emma. It's always a privilege to be here. I firmly believe that knowledge and wisdom are the greatest gifts we can share, especially while we're still alive to do so.
Absolutely, Dr. Rhys. Such a thoughtful philosophy in itself. Before we dive in, a quick reminder. If you've missed any episodes, check out our dedicated playlist to catch up on past philosophers. And if you haven't already, please hit subscribe and let us know in the comments which thinker you'd like us to explore next. Now, without further ado, let's begin. Dr. Rhys, to begin our exploration of Permedius, could you tell us who he was and share some details about his life and personality? Where and when did he live, and how does his era relate to that of Socrates? What was the cultural and political climate of his homeland during his lifetime?
Parmenides of Elea was one of the earliest and most influential pre-Socratic philosophers, born around 515 BCE in the Greek colony of Elea on the southern coast of Italy, in what's today the region of Calabria. As the son of a wealthy aristocratic family, he received the kind of education that combined local religious rites with the early scientific and mathematical teachings circulating in Magna Graecia at the time, particularly those of the Pythagoreans, who had established communities nearby. He is best known for his single surviving work, the poem On Nature, composed in dactylic hexameter. In it, he advances an uncompromising metaphysical thesis that reality is ungenerated, indestructible, unchanging, and one. To Parmenides, all change and plurality are mere illusion, products of deceptive senses rather than of reliable reason. His striking claim, what is, what is not, set the terms for much of later Western metaphysics. Chronologically, Parmenides predates Socrates by a generation. He flourished in the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, several decades before Socrates' birth around 470 BCE. His lifetime overlapped the aftermath of the great Persian invasions, the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, events that stirred a burgeoning sense of Greek identity across the disparate city-states. Elea itself was relatively insulated from mainland conflicts, but as a wealthy port, its citizens were well aware of shifting alliances between Athens, Sparta, and the Persian Empire. Local politics were dominated by oligarchic families, Parmenides' own included, who sponsored philosophical gatherings that weighed questions of being, justice, and the good life. Parmenides' teaching gave rise to the Eleatic school, whose defenders and detractors, such as Zeno of Elea and Melissus of Samos, would rigorously test his ideas. Although only fragments of his poem survive, his radical insistence on the unity and permanence of what is had a lasting impact. Plato, Aristotle, and countless thinkers after them found themselves either grappling with or reacting against Parmenides' vision of an unchanging reality.
That was a fascinating overview of his life and context. Now I'd like to turn to his core philosophy. Could you unpack for our listeners the central notions of Parmenides' thought, his conception of being as one, unchanging reality, his argument that change and plurality are mere illusions, and how he arrived at these conclusions?
Parmenides' philosophy centers on a radical monism, the claim that reality, what he calls being, is a single, undivided, and unchanging whole. Unlike the everyday world of appearances, in which things come into being, pass away, and change form, Parmenides insists that true reality cannot undergo any alteration. His argument unfolds in two main stages. 1. The way of truth. Being is and cannot not be. Parmenides begins by defining being in the most absolute sense. If something is, it must exist without interruption. There can be no non-being, for non-being by definition does not exist. From this premise, it follows that being is eternal. It never came into existence. Indivisible. It cannot be split, or there would be non-being between parts. And changeless. Change would require becoming non-being or coming from non-being, both impossible. 2. the way of opinion, doxa. Senses deceive. Parmenides then contrasts the unchanging truth with the world as we perceive it through our senses, which shows a realm of birth, growth, decay, and death. He labels this the way of opinion, a world of mere appearances and unreliable testimony. Logical rigor overrides common sense. For Parmenides, reasoned argument holds ultimate authority. If our rational deduction demands that change is impossible, then our sensory impressions of change must be discounted as mere illusion or appearance. How he arrived at these conclusions. Logical deduction. Parmenides was among the first to apply strict deductive reasoning to metaphysical questions. He treats being as a logical subject, exploring its attributes by examining what must logically follow from it is. Poetic form. His surviving fragments come to us in a hexameter poem, where a goddess guides him along the two paths of inquiry, truth versus opinion. This mythic framing underscores that his insights were regarded as revelations of cosmic order, not mere personal speculation. Influence on later thought. His uncompromising monism challenged subsequent philosophers, most notably Zeno of Elea, who devised his famous paradoxes to defend Parmenides' denial of motion and plurality, and Aristotle, who would wrestle with reconciling Parmenidean being with observable change. In sum, Parmenides teaches that beneath the flux of our everyday world lies a single, changeless reality knowable only through reason. Everything we take as real change is, in his view, an illusion of the senses, and only by adhering to the path of strict logic can we glimpse the timeless unity of being.
That's a profound distinction between appearance and reality. Given Parmenides' strict insistence that change is illusory, how did subsequent thinkers, like Zeno of Elea with his paradoxes or even Aristotle, respond to or challenge this denial of motion and plurality?
Zeno of Elea and Aristotle represent two of the most important ancient reactions to Parmenides' radical denial of change and plurality. Zeno's paradoxes as a defense of Parmenides. Zeno was a younger contemporary and staunch follower of Parmenides. Rather than attacking his master's claims directly, Zeno devised a series of clever thought experiments, now known as Zeno's paradoxes, to show that the very idea of motion or plurality leads to absurd conclusions when pushed to its logical extreme. 1. The dichotomy paradox points out that before an object can travel a given distance, it must travel half that distance, before that, half of the half, and so on ad infinitum. If space is infinitely divisible, then motion requires completing infinitely many tasks, which seems impossible. 2. Achilles and the tortoise shows that even a swift runner can never overtake a slower one, if the slower one always has a small head start, because Achilles must first reach the tortoise's starting point, by which time the tortoise has moved on, and this process repeats endlessly. 3. The arrow paradox argues that at any instant of time, a flying arrow occupies a single motionless location. So if at every instant it is at rest, motion is an illusion. Zeno's goal was not to claim dogs aren't real, or that planets don't move, but to demonstrate that any coherent account of motion or plurality seemed to commit one to logical impossibilities. In doing so, he buttressed Parmenides' position. If you assume change is real, you end up with contradictions. Therefore, change must be an illusion. Aristotle's reconciliation of Parmenides and experience. Aristotle, writing about a century later, was acutely aware of Zeno's challenges. Rather than accept Parmenides' monism wholesale, Aristotle sought a middle path. He distinguished between potential and actual infinities, and introduced a formal theory of motion and time that avoids the paradoxes. 1. Potential versus actual infinity. Aristotle agreed that one cannot complete an actually infinite sequence of tasks, but he argued that space and time are only potentially divisible. They can be subdivided in thought without ever committing to an actually infinite number of parts coexisting at once. 2. Continuum and instantaneity. He rejected the idea that time is composed of independent static instants. Instead, time and motion are continuous processes. There is no paradoxical frozen instant at which the arrow stands still, because instants are abstractions rather than ontologically real slices of time. 3. Definition of motion. Aristotle defined motion, kinesis, as the actualization of potentiality. clarifying that objects don't need to traverse infinitely many points in a single moment. Rather, they move continuously, actualizing their potential to be at successive positions. By these moves, Aristotle preserved both the insights of Parmenides' critique of naive change and the undeniable reality of motion and plurality in the observable world. Legacy. Zeno's paradoxes forced philosophers to scrutinize the very foundations of space, time, and motion. Aristotle's resolutions in the physics laid the groundwork for subsequent developments in mathematics, especially calculus and the modern understanding of limits, and physics, the study of continuous processes. In effect, the dialogue between Parmenides, Zeno, and Aristotle inaugurated Western philosophy's long engagement with how language, thought, and reality intersect when we talk about change.
That's truly fascinating. Now let's turn to the metaphysical side of Parmenides' thought. For our listeners, could you first clarify what metaphysics actually concerns, and then explain why Parmenides is regarded as one of the earliest thinkers to introduce this concept?
Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that investigates the most fundamental aspects of reality. Questions about what exists, what it means for something to be, and how the things that exist relate to one another. It moves beyond the empirical world of sense experience to examine the underlying principles and structures that make anything possible at all. Parmenides earns his place as one of the very first metaphysicians because he was the first to tackle these above-physics questions systematically. In his only surviving work, the poem On Nature, he drew a sharp distinction between two ways of knowing. 1. The way of truth, aletheia. Reasoned reflection, which reveals that what is must be ungenerated, indestructible, indivisible, and changeless. Parmenides argued that the very concept of nothing is self-contradictory. If nothing truly were, then it would have to be something. 2. The way of opinion, doxa. Sense perception, which tells us the world of birth, change, and death. But Parmenides insisted these appearances cannot be the true substrate of reality. By asserting that genuine being must be eternal and unalterable, he broke with his predecessors, who had sought to explain the material elements of the cosmos, water, air, fire, etc., and shifted philosophy's focus onto questions about being itself. This move to place ontology, the study of being, at the heart of philosophical inquiry, is why we call Parmenides the father of metaphysics. Every subsequent metaphysician, from Empedocles and Plato to Aristotle and beyond, would build on or react to his central insight, that beneath the flux of appearances lies a single, unchanging reality.
That's fascinating. Parmenides elevates an unchanging singular being above all else. Yet we live in a world full of distinct things and constant motion. How did he explain our everyday experience of plurality and change if, in his view, they're just illusions?
Parmenides tackles exactly that tension between our lived experience and his philosophical vision by distinguishing sharply between two ways of investigation, the way of truth, aletheia, and the way of opinion, doxa. 1. The way of truth. In his poem, Parmenides contends that reality, with a capital R, must be one, ungenerated, indestructible, and motionless. Any change, coming to be or passing away, would imply that being is in some sense not being, an outright contradiction. According to him, rational thought alone can access this timeless unity. True being is eternal and homogeneous. It does not admit the distinctions or movements our senses report. 2. The way of opinion. By contrast, the manifold world of trees, people, seasons, and flux belongs to the realm of opinion, useful for daily life, but fundamentally deceptive. Parmenides likens this sensory domain to a dream or a shadow play, offering only appearances. He doesn't dismiss our everyday experience as worthless. Rather, he places it on a lower epistemological tier. We must acknowledge its internal consistency as how things seem, yet never accept it as metaphysical truth. 3. Reconciling the two. Parmenides doesn't propose a direct synthesis. Instead, he issues a methodological warning. We can navigate the world of opinion, practically speaking, but only with full awareness that its phenomena are mere facades over the unmoving core of being. He effectively asks us to live poetically in the sensory realm, while philosophically anchoring ourselves in reason's revelation of oneness. 4. Legacy of the distinction. His rigorous separation of sense and thought laid groundwork for later thinkers, like Plato, who would grapple with the gap between the changing empirical world and an unchanging realm of forms. By framing plurality and change as appearances, Parmenides forces us to question whether true knowledge can ever come from the senses, a challenge that becomes a central theme in the whole of Western metaphysics. In sum, Parmenides doesn't deny that we see trees swaying in the wind or change with the seasons. He simply insists that those phenomena belong to a provisional story we tell ourselves, not to the ultimate nature of reality. True enlightenment, for him, comes when we let go of sense-based belief and hold fast to the unity revealed by rigorous rational inquiry.
That is indeed intriguing. You mentioned earlier that only a handful, perhaps even just one, of Parmenides' works survive intact. What became of his other writings? Could you shed some light on why so much of his corpus was lost over time?
The loss of most of Parmenides' writings is a story common to many early Greek thinkers, whose works survived only through fragile manuscript traditions and selective quotation by later authors. Here are the main factors. 1. Format and medium. Parmenides composed his philosophy as a hexameter poem, likely titled On Nature, written on papyrus scrolls. Papyrus is highly perishable. It deteriorates in humid climates, and after a few centuries, unrecopied rolls simply disintegrated. 2. Limited transmission. Only one copy of Parmenides' poem appears to have been in continuous circulation. As teaching moved from the original Eleatic school in Elea, southern Italy, to centers like Athens and Alexandria, later editors and scribes selected and recopied only portions they deemed most important. Most crucially, the Way of Truth proem, and the two central paths distinguishing reality from mere opinion. 3. Selective quotation. Ancient authors such as Simplicius, Sextus Empiricus, and Plato's successors preserved Parmenides' ideas by quoting key lines in commentaries on metaphysics and logic. Over time, these excerpts became the sole evidence for his full poem, while unquoted stanzas vanished when their scrolls were no longer recopied. 4. Intellectual shifts. After Aristotle and the Peripatetic school systematized metaphysics in prose treatises, poetic philosophizing fell out of favor. So fewer scribes saw value in copying Parmenides' dense hexameter. Christian scribes in late antiquity prioritized biblical and theological texts, further marginalizing pagan poetry. 5. Resulting fragments. Today, we possess approximately 160 lines of Parmenides as fragments, collected in modern critical editions. These survive in quotations by Neoplatonist commentators, e.g., Simplicius' commentary on Aristotle's physics, or as scholia in Byzantine manuscript margins. In sum, a combination of perishable materials, transmission by selective copying, changing intellectual fashions, and the vicissitudes of medieval manuscript preservation left us with only a fragmentary echo of Parmenides' full poetic masterpiece.
Fascinating. Parmenides' emphasis on the unchanging being and his critique of sensory opinion clearly revolutionized early metaphysics. But today, in our rapidly evolving world of technology, social change, and shifting identities, how can we apply Parmenides' insights about permanence and illusion to make sense of modern life?
Parmenides' core teaching, that true reality is an unchanging, indivisible being, and that all apparent change is illusory, may at first seem divorced from our hyperdynamic modern existence. But it actually offers a powerful lens for understanding and coping with today's relentless flux. 1. Cutting through ephemeral distractions. In an age of ever-scrolling social media feeds, hourly news cycles, and instant notifications, we can feel constantly pulled from one headline, trend, or app to the next. Parmenides reminds us that these surface-level phenomena, our news feeds, our social media personas, even our fluctuating moods, are like shadows flickering on the wall of the cave. They come and go, but they do not ultimately define who we are. By cultivating an inner sense of being, our fundamental values, our essential purpose, we create an unshakable reference point amid the whirlwind of daily updates. 2. Anchoring identity in enduring values. Today's identities are often shaped by careers, social status, or virtual likes, all of which can shift overnight. Parmenides' insistence on the permanence of being encourages us to ground our self-understanding not in external markers of success, but in deeper, unchanging commitments, ethical principles, lifelong learning, compassion, that remain constant even as our roles and circumstances evolve. 3. Technology as illusion and tool. Virtual reality, AI-generated deepfakes, and curated online selves exemplify how technology can manufacture convincing illusions. Parmenides would warn us to question whether what we see in our VR goggles or on a polished Instagram grid truly corresponds to reality. Yet, the same technology can also help us access timeless insights. Meditation apps that quiet the sensory mind, online communities that sustain philosophical dialogue, digital records that preserve teachings beyond any one lifetime. In both cases, awareness of the distinction between appearance, the seeming, and essence, the being, is crucial. 4. Mental stability in rapid change. If every new app, algorithm update, or corporate restructuring threatens to upend our work or social life, we can fall into chronic anxiety. Parmenides' philosophy invites us to practice metaphysical mindfulness, noticing the ceaseless parade of change in our environment while refraining from identifying with it. This creates psychological resilience. We learn to flow with external shifts without losing our internal stability. 5. Sustainable action. Finally, Parmenides teaches that change for its own sake is empty. Before we chase every new opportunity, we pause and ask, does this align with our core being? In business, this might mean resisting the latest tech fad, unless it serves our organization's enduring mission. In personal life, it might mean prioritizing relationships and projects that resonate with our deepest convictions, rather than being swept along by the next popular self-help trend. In sum, by internalizing Parmenides' distinction between the permanent reality of being and the merely apparent world of becoming, we gain a grounding perspective. We become less reactive to every headline or tweet, more clear-sighted about what truly matters, and more capable of intentional, values-driven action, no matter how rapidly the world around us appears to change.
And finally, in keeping with our tradition of closing with a philosopher's own words, are there any fragments or quotations from Parmenides that have survived? If so, which one resonates most with you and why?
Parmenides' philosophical legacy comes down to us almost entirely in the form of poetic fragments from his single known work, commonly titled On Nature. Although the complete poem once comprised some 800 lines, only about 160 lines have survived, preserved by later authors who quoted or summarized key passages. Among those precious fragments, the most famous, and the one I find most resonant, is this concise declaration: what is, what is not, is not. With these 4 simple yet profound words, Parmenides captures the very heart of his ontology. Reality is an unchanging, indivisible being, and anything that we might imagine as non-being cannot truly exist. This aphorism underpins his radical claim that all apparent change, motion, or multiplicity is illusory. Only the one, pure being, truly is. Why does this fragment speak so powerfully across millennia? First, it shows Parmenides' courage in going against the grain of intuitive experience. Rather than accept that things come into being and pass away, he insisted on the logical necessity of permanence. Second, its brevity masks a depth that still challenges students of metaphysics today. Are our senses mistaken? If we grant that what is not cannot be thought or spoken, must we then conclude that non-existence plays no role even in our imagination? Finally, this declaration beautifully exemplifies Parmenides' conviction that philosophy must proceed by rigorous reason rather than by unreliable sense perception. It invites us, even now, to question the foundations of our common assumptions and to seek truth in the clarity of logical necessity. For me, that enduring call to think beyond appearances and to ground our understanding in the very structure of being itself is the most powerful gift Parmenides left to the Western philosophical tradition.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rhys, for such a profound insight into a philosopher so little known. Parmenides' work might be fragmentary, but his daring vision reshaped the course of Western thought. I believe everyone, whether steeped in philosophy or simply curious, can gain inspiration from his commitment to reason and the unity of being. Dedicating this entire episode to Parmenides feels like the justice his ideas deserve. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Emma. It's always a pleasure to share Parmenides' extraordinary legacy with your listeners. His courage to challenge appearances with logic remains a timeless gift.
And thank you all for listening to this episode of the greatest philosophers of all time on the History Whispers channel. If you enjoyed our conversation, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us which philosopher you'd like us to explore next. Remember, history is whispering.